Well, hello. I'm Pastor Darryl Webster of the Emmanuel Missionary Baptist Church, also leader and founder of Men's Boot Camp. Welcome to our second edition of Conversation with a Cause. We're so happy to be celebrating 15 years of saving lives and changing destinies. And we have literally just been blessed with the progress that men are making from all walks of life. Our last conversation was a conversation with a cause around race, and I'm happy today to have a conversation with a cause around mental health. Today we have with us Dr. Kory Carey, a psychologist who's partnering and teaming up with us to talk about mental health stigma in our community. Kory, welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're so happy to have you. She has an extensive resume, been a psychologist for now 10 years. Tell me a little bit about why you got involved with wanting to help people from the psychologist standpoint.
Well, probably as most people in this field would say, it started way back when as a younger person, a teenager and a young adult. You kind of have people drawn to you who, are going through things and want to talk stuff out. And so I was just always kind of that helper in people, and decided I want to kind of pursue it in school and follow the path all the way through.
Wow, well, it's interesting today, I'm so happy that we're able to have you on our show. For the last 3 weeks, I've been speaking on mental health issues, particularly now since everybody is in isolation because of the pandemic, also the protests. And our purpose for having Bootcamp Connect Conversations with a Cause is because we want to be able to enlighten, engage, and equip people with not just philosophy, but strategies to be able to cope with everyday life. And so I wanted to have this conversation birthed out of the sermons that I preached on mental health, because about a year ago, the Bootcamp Connect, we now, thank God, offer a mental health component whereby we can do addictions training and mental health training, particularly for people from all walks of life. But our focus work is, we've been seeing thousands of men for the last 15 years. And we moved our program to the prison. We were featured on Focus on the Family, which deals primarily with family issues. And they're on 1,500 radio stations, and they reach several million people. And we were able to, actually, God opened the door for us to bring our boot camp into the prison. Now, just briefly, a brief metaphor for boot camp, we talk about how soldiers need specialized training to be able to fight in the army. We believe that not just men, but people need specialized training. Families need specialized training to deal with the complex issues of life. And so in our culture, it's really interesting, not just our culture, but the United States alone. I was reading a stat that says in the United States, almost half of adults, 46.4%, will experience a mental illness during their lifetime. Now, I'm a pastor. You are the practitioner. And dealing with so many men, I was just going at it from the spiritual standpoint. Now, I believe God can change anybody, anywhere, at any time. But it dawned on me some of the issues are also deeper in the spiritual component, and therefore they need professional help, like a psychologist. They need a physician to help them with their biological. Talk a little bit about the issue of mental health and this 46.4% of people in the United States who have to deal with it.
Well, I think you're right. It's an alarming stat. That's almost half, right, of adults. That's a lot of people. And I think when you take into account the current stage that we're in terms of the pandemic and the sort of social unrest in this country, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if just kind of this period alone brought with it more prevalence, more instances of mental illness. I think that number may not sound as alarming when you kind of break down what we mean when we say mental illness. I think a lot of people, when they hear mental illness, they think extreme, right? The individuals who might need acute care, who have to be kind of locked in a hospital, or some of the most severe illnesses. But most people would probably say, yeah, I've been sad, and I've been sad for a period of time where it impacted my life, or I've been worried. And so when you start getting into depression, anxiety, some of the symptoms and things that people experience, it's not as uncommon as we might think.
You know, one of the things that I really want to address today, even as you sit and we share time together, the whole stigma that's actually tied around mental illness, you know, particular in our culture with African Americans. When I first heard of that term, mental illness, or going to see a psychologist, I thought people, well, let's just face it, that they were crazy. When I was in the second grade, I remember my second grade teacher sending a note home telling my mom that I needed to go see a psychiatrist, or psychologist, I'm sorry. And I remember my mom asked one of my siblings, well, what does that mean? And somebody said, they think he's crazy. Well, as a result, I thank God I'm not crazy. My wife may still call me crazy, but I'm not crazy. I may drive her crazy. Talk about the stigma of mental illness, and particularly as it relates to the community of African Americans.
Sure. I mean, that word alone, right, the crazy, or I've heard a lot of younger people use mental almost to kind of categorize struggles. That word alone is evidence of stigma. Stigma meaning a negative attitude, or some type of judgment or discrimination against people because they might be struggling or be diagnosed with a mental illness. It's absolutely pervasive, yes, in the African American community, but I also think just general society, and some of the reasons or the ways that stigma runs rampant in the Black community is similar to society. I think, you know, I like to kind of imagine that stigma is based a lot in expectations. So we have this expectation for how things should be, or what normal is, right? And so when you sort of veer away from the norm, then people, you know, might view that negatively. In the Black community specifically, I think about just some of the cultural norms of what it means to be Black. This idea of strength. You need to kind of be strong, and we, I think, as a community, historically have gone through so much that strength is sort of a value, and I think an expectation. And I think it's a misconception that to have a mental illness or to struggle is weak. That's a misconception. And based on the stat you just read, we know that it's way more normal to struggle than not. And so the stigma piece comes because we don't want to acknowledge it as common, or as you know, a possibility.
You know, there's another stat that says 5% of adults 18 or older experience a mental illness in any 1 year, equivalent to 43.8 million people. Now think about that. 5% of adults 18 or older experience a mental illness in any 1 year, and that's equivalent to 43.8 million people. That's a lot of people.
Yeah, it is.
Speak to that.
I think, again, you know, I think back to sort of how we define or look at mental illness, and people are diagnosed or categorized as mentally ill when they have, you know, they either have some sort of biological basis, and when I say that, I mean something kind of you're born with, something in your mind. For some people, it could be a matter of sort of brain chemistry and the way that your brain produces chemicals. Sometimes it's something that's there that sort of manifests based on stressors, but a lot of times people are impacted by environmental factors and stresses of life, overwhelm, trauma. A pandemic, for instance, that sort of completely takes away your sense of normality or what's normal. And so when you think about sort of what underlies or undergirds mental illness or healthy mental stability, there are a lot of things that can kind of shake us off guard, and I think it's the extent to which people cope with it or have the abilities to cope that dictates kind of whether they're healed or sort of make some progress, or whether they sort of regress and have challenges.
Well, and you're certainly right. I was one of the sermons that I preached. I talk about when you talk about dealing with mental illness, back to the statement you said. Some of it can happen with biology, meaning that there's something going on in your body, whether it's some sort of chemical imbalance that's in your body that pushes you into anxiety or fear or panic attacks. Then there, in my case, it was the trauma of watching domestic violence carried out in my household. My dad, who dealt with addiction, an alcohol addiction for the biggest part of his life, and then that would push him to be violent. And I would go to school, and because of this trauma, and I would act out. And then, my second grade teacher said something is going on psychologically with this young man. And I just want you to know that when these things are going on psychologically, it doesn't mean that you're crazy. It doesn't mean that you're crazy, but from the same standpoint, if no one tells that second grade student or that adult that they're not crazy, then this negative stigma comes with it. Then I moved from there to sometimes the whole mental illness can come on, depression by physiological, meaning that you need some rest. You're overworked, overburdened. And then because I'm a pastor, I talk about it also from the spiritual standpoint, where you can deal with burnout, fear, or discouragement. Talk to us as it relates to the mental illness that people are dealing with as it relates to the isolation, school shuttings down, children are at home, and with this pandemic. Because we've already established, if you're dealing with a mental illness, you're not crazy.
Right. And to the point about the isolation and sort of the impact of this pandemic, two of the, I guess one of the first things I'll mention, two of the most common mental illnesses or diagnoses tend to be anxiety, depression. Anxiety is the top. About 20% of people might experience anxiety.
Talk a little bit about anxiety. When you say anxiety, what do you mean from a practitioner standpoint?
So anxiety is essentially a level of fear or worry, doubt. Most people, everybody, quite frankly, experiences some level of anxiety or worry. So, for example, you and I sitting down to do this talk, we may have both kind of come on here and kind of had some butterflies in the stomach, just nervousness, right? That's normal. Most people should experience a level of anxiety. It lets you know that, you're kind of on and aware and want to kind of do your best. But some people experience this fear and this worry to an extent that is kind of paralyzing, or it gets in the way of them being able to do day-to-day activities. And so when we talk about being diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, things have probably gotten to a point where you're having a hard time managing. And so, yeah, if that kind of helps. So worry,
that's day-to-day.
Day-to-day.
Okay.
Day-to-day. And when you think about a pandemic, for instance, which most of us have never lived through, right?
Yeah, right.
This is a very new reality, and at the core of it is that people now have this worry that they're not safe, right? There's a very real fear around death, for instance, or significant illness. And so when your sense of safety is shaken or is tested, that kind of changes maybe how you operate on a day-to-day. Some people might be more nervous about leaving the house and things like that. Especially children, right? And especially you referenced that what's normal for children is social interaction.
Absolutely.
It's being able to go to school, to have a level of structure, the learning. It's built into our country's framework that you go to school from 5 to 18 or whatever, and this is your kind of day-to-day. And so, yes, there are supposed to be breaks, like summer breaks and things, but our children have been on this sort of extended break. And what was normal and what was an outlet, what was structure and provided some sort of entertainment and connection has been taken away from them. And so you know, I would expect that folks might be sadder more or worried more. I have a little one, and I certainly have seen some changes in her willingness to go out of the house or feeling like maybe there's danger out there. And so, yeah, the pandemic and just, you know, kind of and honestly, the social unrest and the things that have happened in this country this year all play a role into how people are coping.
Well, you think about the whole pandemic issue. We're looking at stats. They used to say it was 1 out of 5. Now they're saying 1 out of 3 people are dealing with some sort of emotional or mental disorder because of this whole pandemic. You know, trying to get used to coping with life, and they said depression right now, you know, that feeling low and that whole dejection piece is on the rise. And we know that in our community that before this happened, black people dealt with, and people in poverty, we dealt with these issues very frequently, not just to mention the trauma. But I guess as it relates to the pandemic, what are some of the tactical and practical steps, first of all, people can take to deal with the anxiety, the emotions, the depression that they're feeling, and the hopelessness that they're dealing with? Because we don't know how long this pandemic is going to continue. But what are some practical and tactical steps that we can take?
You know, I immediately go back to our conversation about stigma, right? And I think one of the first things that we have to do is exactly what you're doing, what you've been doing in the sermon series you've had, is the acknowledgement. We have to acknowledge that we're struggling, right? And that, I mean, it doesn't surprise me that the statistic has gone from 1 in 5 to 1 in 3. One of the biggest one of the biggest sort of solutions or outlets or tips we give to folks who are struggling with depression is the social piece, right? So in some cases, yes, medication is going to be warranted, and we can kind of talk about that. But, you know, we want folks to kind of connect with what we say are healthy supports, right? So people who they feel are safe and kind of have their best interests at heart, to kind of fight back against that isolation that's there. We want people to try to connect or engage in activities that, you know, are helpful or sort of interest to them, whether it's a hobby, exercise and things of that nature. With the pandemic, I know we've had to kind of get creative with that, like how we sort of, you know, engage in those social and emotional outlets. And so those are some of the getting sort of engaging in the day-to-day self-care, so getting enough rest, trying to eat right. I referenced this quarantine 15. When I was in college, they say the freshman's 15, you gain 15 pounds. We've kind of been sitting around, and most people have probably gained weight and are getting out of the habits of things we didn't know we would be kind of sitting around this long. And so I think, and I've also, I think, seen a resurgence recently in folks reconnecting with fitness and realizing, okay, we might be in this a little bit for the long haul. Let me not just kind of stay in this moping place. How do I, you know, reconnect with exercise, with eating appropriately, clean eating and things of that nature, cooking or other types of creative outlets. With the younger folks, I think, especially with this sort of e-learning period that we're kind of in, where folks can't get into school or get around the friends. Some are, I know. You know, I think parents are going to have to be very vigilant and be aware and attentive to kids. One of the tips that is often given about how to kind of deal with the pandemic with younger children, right, like maybe your elementary age, is having open conversations with them about it. I think we can't assume, we don't want to assume anything, and really kind of sit down and say, hey, you know, how are you doing with all these changes? Especially children who are maybe too young to have the language to use, maybe using creative ways to help them express what they're feeling, to identify and name their emotions, maybe using videos online or, you know, sort of creative content to say, hey, you know, here's a facial expression, like which one matches how you're feeling. I think as adults we have to model for the children, what's healthy. So being able to say, wow, this is rough on me, or I'm feeling this way, and modeling for them that it's okay to not feel okay, but also to kind of take the steps to do something about that.
You referenced quarantine 15 because I heard someone else reference that just because when you're in isolation you want to eat,
Yeah.
and different food becomes your comfort food. But I love what you said about finding other healthy ways also to adapt and to make children feel like they're staying connected.
Right.
I'm concerned because I was reading a statistic that says 20% of youth ages 13 through 18 live with mental health conditions. And then it says 11% of youth have a mood disorder. 10% of youth have behavior conduct disorders, and then 8% of youth have an anxiety disorder. Now, that's ages 13 to 18. What about those children that are younger than that and parents really don't know how to identify that their children are dealing with these disorders? What would you say to them, particularly during this quarantine? They don't get a chance to see their friends. What would you say to them on ways to cope? Because children have a way of internalizing a lot of things.
Yeah.
The reason why we're having this conversation on mental health and talking about the stigma and some of the awareness of it is to first equip parents, make them aware, but also try to give you some things to identify and where to go for help. What would you say? I know that's kind of a loaded statement, but how would you approach those children under the ages of 13 and also those children those youth that are between the ages of 13 and 18?
Yeah, I mean, you made a good point, and what stuck out to me is you mentioned internalizing, and so it makes me think about even the way that children will communicate or express what they're going through, because they don't have the language. Younger children don't have the language to say, I feel overwhelmed or I feel hopeless. It might come out in their behaviors, and so knowing your child and trying to pay attention to what is typical for them, what seems to be kind of off a little bit is going to be important, because each child is different. And so for folks who are younger than 13, for instance, there might be a change in their behavior or change in their sleep. Maybe they're sleeping too much, or not enough. I know certainly, my kiddo got off track with sleep schedule and things like that. Yeah. Maybe they're wanting to eat because they're maybe bored or eating out of boredom and things like that. And maybe they're irritable and maybe aggressive outbursts, because I think we think just what is wrong, what is wrong with you, without having to pause and say, okay, if they don't have the language to say, I feel afraid when you leave the house, Mom. Wow. Or I feel hopeless that I'll ever get to see my friends again, right? No 3 or no 5-year-old, no 7-year-old is talking in that way usually. It might be coming out in their behavior. So I think for parents, maybe kind of taking a breath first when you're observing some things that might be off base for your kid, and kind of reflecting on what could be causing this. I think one of the first things we need to do is give ourselves a little grace, I often say, because we are truly in some challenging times. And so if a parent can pause and say, okay, these are not normal circumstances. Maybe my child's been in the house for the last 4 months, on and off, of course they would be this way. Of course, I think that's the first thing, to kind of breathe and take some perspective about what's going on. But also just directly talk to the kid about what's happening. And so if your child, or if the child tends to be one that requires more activity, you might have to find some creative ways to do that. Are there ways to kind of take walks with the kid, get them out of the house? I know we're getting to a point where there's maybe less restrictions in the pandemic than there was a few months ago, and so even setting up kind of play dates, as you would call it, as is safe, right? If there are people, whether family members or other children that kids connect to, can I get them to go kind of run around with them, or how can I use online games or online sort of networking to help the kids stay connected? Can they play long distance games with folks? The structure is going to be incredibly important as well. I know many of us are guilty of letting kids stay up till 2 a.m.
Absolutely, yeah.
But can we get them on a routine where they're getting enough sleep, where there's some predictability, right? Because with the pandemic and the social unrest, and we don't know when schools are going to open, that there's a lot of like unpredictability there. And if kids don't see a level of control reflected in the grown-ups around them, of course they're going to feel out of control. And so can I find a way to build some routine and put some control and consistency back in what they do see?